In recent months, I rediscovered a particularly contentious set of rules in the hobby. It's a rules concept from Dungeons and Dragons, and it's something that subtly divides gamers into camps. It's also a concept that I think might have application in other games like Traveller. It's something that you wouldn't think would be so subtly divisive. What am I talking about? Cantrips. Those trusty little zero-level spells that are always at hand and nowadays can be cast at will. Now, why do I think this idea might be applicable to a game like Traveller? Well, that's because there are things like drones and computers, and there are particular, very repetitive and minor things that you do with them, and the quicker that the game can resolve them, and yet at the same time empower players to get information or to advance the narrative, well, then so much the better. And yet I find that there are a couple of factions that disagree with me. And now, time for some skits. Cantrips undermine the core principles of expendable Vancian magic, and they outclass and outshine fighters and thieves.
Monty Cook just put cantrips in the game because he got beat up in high school.
Yeah, cantrips are cool, but they seem a little bit weak. I mean, why use a screwdriver when you've got a power drill?
Now, of course, my point of view on this subject is cantrips are my best friend, and yours. I'm the complex games apologist. Let's look at this a bit deeper. So let's just get this out of the way, folks. I want to brush aside the notion that cantrips that deal meaningful amounts of damage, like as in a longbow or a crossbow's worth, are somehow imbalancing to the game, or that they outshine the idea of traditional archery. For one, I can draw back a bowstring in utter silence. Yet, when a caster begins uttering the incantations for something like, say, Ghost Touch, it's loud. There's a man saying magic words. It also means that he's the man who's going to say magic words later. You've blown your cover. Secondly, I'd like to point out that cantrips are almost certainly going to reveal your position by the flash of light, the line tracing a firebolt from you to your target. So, in contrast, I think there's still some value to things like javelins and crossbows. And at the same time, I think it's a lot of flavor for one set of characters to start shouting at the top of their lungs magical incantations, while the others go about their business in dutiful and careful silence, loading their crossbows.
So I hope some of that can put to rest some of the off-the-cuff reservations that some folks may have about cantrips. And these ideas that cantrips shed light and make noise are important to another idea that I think is why they're so valuable in the bread and butter of actual play: quantization. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when I play a little ditty into my synthesizer, poorly, like this, and then when I play it back, it takes the musical information and forces it onto a quantized grid based on the tempo and the note value that I'm playing for. Now, quantization, I think, got a bad rap from 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, where literally everything was quantized into shifts, squares, dailies, and encounter powers. The really momentous occasions of play were really made clinical. But when we're talking about the connective tissue of play, the carefully edging around a corner in a dungeon, or breaching a door, what we're looking for is something that's a shortcut. Because otherwise, those sorts of scenes are cut from the narrative. And one of the things that I return to on this channel over and over is how important connective tissue and the granularity of just playing through the small moments is really important to having real power as a player. Because the fast forward button is really something that's generally controlled by the game master in his power as the storyteller or the narrator, or maybe the editor, as I made a video about, which wasn't all that well received. So perhaps the best way to show you how these quantized shortcuts really grease the wheels of actual play and let you play with the theme of Dungeons & Dragons, a magical fantasy world, and the bread and butter of its play, exploration, and bring the connective tissue on camera, is to introduce you to one of my favorite non-combat cantrips, light. Now, if we were playing Traveller, the theme would be technology and enterprise. And if we were playing World of Darkness, it might be intrigue and politicking or negotiation. And there might be some shortcuts or some rotes in there. Many games have contacts, and getting that information from the contact is something that's both difficult and time-consuming, and yet almost always trite. So perhaps something like cantrips is in order for that mechanic. So without further ado, Let's illuminate this topic by examining my favorite cantrip.
Both the 5th edition and Pathfinder versions of Light are very similar. At a cost of 1 action, they give you a long duration, and they require a material component, at least for arcane casters, that means that if anything gets out of hand, if it's excessively used, you can bring that into line. If the party members are stripped of their goods, if they're disabled in some fashion, then their material components could be taken away from them as well, or their divine focus. So this means that if you want to take away this toy for some limited occasions, then it's within your power to do so as the game master. Now, what can you do with it? Well, one of my favorite tricks, and something that I was doing long before cantrips were at will, was throwing a glowing rock down a hallway. Now, if you look at this corridor, if I'm holding the light source, I won't be able to tell that there's an intersection coming up quite so readily as if I threw the light source down the hallway. Say I cast light on something that rolls easily, like an orange or even a children's ball. Well, in that case, I would see the shadows change, and I would get a clue that there's an intersection coming up. And that would give me and my party the opportunity to have a tactical little bit of fun breaching that corner and peering around. Now, did I also reveal that I was coming by throwing that light down the hallway? Absolutely. And that's where those opportunity costs come into play. It's much more fun to engage those opportunity costs than it is to engage thinking about whether I'm going to sacrifice a spell slot, because there's always an economy of gotcha when it comes to Vancian casting in my experience, where I often try and use utility spells, but then it turns out that the occasion is not worthy of it. And if you want these things to really matter and be played with, as in see time at the table, then they have to be accessible. And these opportunity costs become magnified that much more when you bring into play spellcasters that have a limited list of spells known when it comes to bards or sorcerers. Do you really think a sorcerer is going to give up the ability to cast something, say, like Charm Person with his first level spell slots, in order to cast Light now and again for a very high cost as well? No. Now, Dark Vision has almost rendered the whole economy of Light often difficult to see play at your table. But I want to tell you about some other modulations, some interesting things. Say that you have a party full of dwarves who are exploring a giant cavern in the Underdark. Well, cast light on a crossbow quarrel, and they can cast it across into the vastness of this cavern and get an idea of what the lay of the land is. By the same token, if a thief is going to be sneaking through the Underdark or any dungeon, then it would be much more convenient to have a light wrapped in a cloth or handkerchief than it would be to be carrying around a fire. And you also have the opportunity, if you want to bring in things like lanterns that are mirrored as a cylinder to make it so that there's not that blinding effect. And then there are the really interesting novelty uses. I could cast it on a tasty morsel and give it to a little vermin, and that might show me the way that they are seeing their way through the wall. I might cast it and then drop it into a deep and dark body of water and see how far it sinks, or any sort of chasm. These are the sorts of things that are really fun to do with light in a game about exploration and darkness underground. But if you're using up your consumables, well then either you're stretching verisimilitude if you ignore and don't track consumables directly, or you're actually burning up your ability to stay underground, literally. And I went through a lot of gold pieces buying sun rods doing these tricks before. And that's because first level spells were so costly at the table that I was playing at that it was more worthwhile to make my own sun rods using alchemy or to buy them from the store than it was to use a first level spell slot. Now let's consider for a moment the idea of projecting this analogy onto a game like Traveler. Now, low berth passengers are something that I think should be pretty routine. It should be something that is just normal. You take it for granted when you are doing it just to keep the bills paid and the lights on in your starship. Perhaps 10 voyages go by without incident where you take on these kind of desperate migrants that are willing to take the risk of dying just to get to another planet. But then sometimes things go differently. And I think it'd be much more interesting that when the unexpected happens, and say a prisoner comes out of Cyronic sleep sometime in jump space and becomes a hijacker, or a stowaway. I think it's much more interesting to look back into the ship's records and to have a little bit of a voiceover, or perhaps hand a dossier to the characters about who this person is, than it is to cover it ahead of time every single time. Because you want to take it for granted. You want to take for granted paying your bills and hustling a little bit, because you want to spend time in Traveler on the big opportunities, the whales, the lucrative chances, the things that bring on the lawyer's guns and money. And sometimes these little things off to the side are the salt and pepper. But as many cooks will tell you, seasoning is what makes the dish. And that's what connective tissue is to me, really. It's those salt and pepper shakers that are on the table at a restaurant, the mustard and ketchup bottles. They're the things you can do to your food in the same way the cantrips are things that your character can do. They can just reach out and grab it. And when it's different, when the ketchup is spoiled or turns out to be spicy, well, those are some interesting occasions. They're exceptional. And in the meantime, well, the food is edible. I'm the complex games apologist, and sometimes I make odd analogies like this to brighten your day and illuminate topics in the tabletop gaming world. If you enjoyed this video, after my short advertisement, I'll talk about how cantrips carried to excess are just not that big of a deal. And in the meantime, have a great day and shed a little light on things. Thank you for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed what you've seen here, maybe check out one of my in-depth video essays on topics in the tabletop gaming world, or subscribe with alerts so that you get updated anytime I put up new content here on YouTube. And above all, let me know what you think about this topic and about my videos in general by leaving a like or a dislike, and especially your own opinions in the comments below. Oh hey, you're still here. Well, Create Water. This is the one that years and years ago I had a little bit of a tiff about. A guy was thinking about how deserts could be irrigated using those gallons of water that could be repeatedly cast. It was literally the one reason that he wasn't interested in moving to Pathfinder. So, I want you to take a look at this spell for a second and notice the water subtype. I want you to think about how there are fire outsiders. There are things like a Freet that would be pretty offended if their haunts on the material plane became wet and soggy. And by the same token, there might be folks like Merid that inhabit the elemental plane of water who are a little upset about their future children or the kind of elemental stuff that their little underlings are born from is being kidnapped from their realm en masse. What if, after the 1000th casting of Create Water, well, a few water methods started to slip through and became gremlins in the works of this irrigation project? The thing is that if you let these things go into excess, if your characters want to carry them into excess, well, bring on zany. That's what I have to say. Now, on to another side of the coin. Now, on to the other side of the coin. Detect magic. Now, this is something that I have seen and carried to excess myself, which is constantly scanning like a radar dish. If your character wants to be uttering incantations and constantly recasting the spell, having his eyes glazed over into the back of his head like this, well, then that's what comes of it. There's another Pathfinder cantrip, something that I'd like to talk about in more detail in another video, called Haunted Fey Aspect. And yes, that's exactly what it is. You do get 1 point of damage reduction versus one enemy, and it has a meaningful duration. But if your character wants to go around in every dungeon, looking like a creepy member of the Elder race, well, then that's the opportunity cost that you pay. And by this I mean that it's important to consider what these spells are, what they do, and how they inhabit the world that they live in. Because that's where the game really takes place, on the other side of the looking glass.